Hi, friends. We're here with Coach Adnan Kadir for our, it's June already, wow, for our June educational series. Coach Kadir has had an amazingly storied career, but long story short, and I hope he'll get to that a little bit, but long story short, a lot of coaching and a lot of, if you want to become a stronger cyclist, if you just even enjoy bicycling, and you want to keep doing it for your whole life. A lot of times, and a lot of coaching and a lot of coaching software that you adapt is really kind of brutal and only really aimed right at super racers wanting to get faster. Coach Kadir will definitely take you there and has not only currently athletes that are taking podiums down left and right, but has a large roster of them. But the Coach Kadir also is the CEO and founder of a software company called VeloPro, which is a cycling software training program that has artificial intelligence that kind of works with your lifestyle. And so that's what I think is really not just great about the software, but also great about Coach Kadir's style of training is he takes into account that we're all human beings and that we can't hit it all hard like 20-year-olds anymore. So
sure.
I appreciate Coach Kadir agreeing to talk to us. We all have it's kind of century season right now, and it's big ride season, and it's group ride season, and hopefully some of the intelligence that will come forth today will help us continue to do that and maybe even do it with more enjoyment and comfort. With that said, I will turn it over to you, Coach.
Okay. So I'm not actually sure what exactly you want me to cover, but I'm ready to cover whatever.
If you could talk, okay, about, so basically your audience is not the high-end racer. It's,
sure, right.
Let's say age 35 to 75 to 80-year-olds whom are very avid cyclists who love cycling, so much so that we're in bike clubs, that we ride every week, and we ride a lot every week. And we are putting, Gears is putting on an event coming up in August called the Blackberry Bramble, where we have multiple distances. And if you could talk about maybe, here we are in June, maybe how to up our game, maybe fine tune our games a little bit, fine tune our casual rides a bit toward training for maybe our first metric century, or maybe our first 100, or maybe our first 150 even. That would be very helpful. And if you could also cover recovery.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
We'll start.
Yeah, we can do that. So basically training.
Training.
Right. So, I imagine, if I were sort of talking to a group of novices who are just starting out, the conversation might be a little bit different, but you guys all ride, you probably have ridden for a number of years at various levels. And I'm guessing that most of you ride pretty consistently, even a little bit in the winter. Is that a fair assumption, since you're a cycling club? Yeah. And so everybody's going to have what coaches call the foundation, right? It's the base upon which you build the rest of your fitness. I actually like to call it the fitness house, and some coaches have stolen that from me. But it's just like a house. You build a foundation of endurance, and then you build a little first floor of tempo work, and a second floor of threshold and VO2, and then you have a peak where you have like your top form. So for doing events that are, primarily endurance events that don't require, a whole lot of covering attacks or accelerations, you don't necessarily have to get to that peak, because that peak's only sustainable for maybe a couple of weeks at a time. You can have several peaks a year, but they have to be, for most people, they have to be spaced out by, probably a month and a half or 2 months, 6 to 8 weeks. But if you're an endurance rider doing centuries or more than that, you don't necessarily need to get to that peak. You just need to have a nice first and second floor, right? And you definitely want to have a solid foundation, because if you don't do a lot of riding and then you suddenly do a bunch of higher intensity stuff, you'll gain fitness for sure, but your ability to train consistently will be compromised, and you'll sort of like, you'll have to take extra recovery time. So instead of having a nice graph that kind of goes up and you get fit and you kind of stay fit the whole year, it'll be more like, oh, I'm tired. Oh, I'm tired. And you'll kind of go up and down. And the interesting thing about that is that that applies to training throughout a season, right? Without a foundation. And it also applies, curiously, to the single event level. In so far as if you're doing, say, a time trial, right? Like the Coburg time trials that get put on down there. If you warm up and you put a nice foundation on the effort you're about to make, you'll have a nice ramp up and a steady effort throughout the time trial. If you go into it not warmed up, and you can try it, you'll constantly be you'll be bumping up against that rev limiter, and then you'll come down, have to recover, and your whole time trial will just be a mixed up matter of trying to recover and then get back to your pace. So the whole idea of a foundation starts at the training level, but it also applies to the event level, especially high intensity events. Obviously, low intensity events like centuries, actually, it applies to that too. If you start too hard, you'll spend the rest of the day like just trying to recover from that, and your blood glucose level will be fluctuating, and you'll throw everything off. So it's important to warm up, start steadily for whatever you do. And in terms of training for a season, your warm up is that foundation building, right? And so that's endurance rides. Mostly 1.5, 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours, longer than your average like 1 hour lunch ride. At sort of a moderate intensity. You can still talk to your friends, hold a conversation, but you're working, right? You're kind of breathing hard. If you have a power meter or a heart rate monitor, that's what we call level 2, right? There's level 1, which is recovery. Level 2 is endurance. Level 3 is tempo, which is a little bit harder to hold a conversation. Level 4, you can't really talk to anybody because you're kind of going next to flat out for a good period of time. So what you want to do, if you're starting in June and you have an event, when did you say, August?
Yep, mid-August.
Mid-August,
yep.
Right. So it's exactly 8 weeks away right now. So assuming you all have a decent foundation, now's a good time to start building a little bit of intensity. And you might ask, well, why should I build intensity if the whole ride is just going to be at endurance pace? And that's because that's a good question. And there's a couple of reasons. The first reason is that intensity is an efficient way to gain endurance, because as you go up the house, any work you do at any floor also counts for the rest of them, right? So if you do VO2 or threshold work, you're doing that, but you're also building you're also building endurance under that. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because unless the ride is completely flat and there's almost no variation, you're going to want to be able to go a little harder on those hills, or at least sustain a decent effort as you climb the hills. And then, more importantly, you're going to want to be able to recover from those climbs so that you can go the distance. So it builds, it's a quicker way to build endurance, and it's a great way to be able to sustain some intensity and recover from that intensity during your ride. So you can get away with it. Is the whole ride flat? I don't think it is.
So there's the Gears group has a lot. We have an amazing library of rides that we're always doing every week, but also the centuries and whatnot. We're talking, we got one century event and one route that's 115 miles and maybe 4,000 to 6,000 feet of climbing. I think. Aaron can correct me. But there's some, you know, down here in the coastal range, we got some hills that hit us like walls.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So you're all, so I mean, obviously any work you do will benefit you in sort of your daily training, not just for the event you're doing, but building in that intensity into your program, building in some intensity while you're climbing as well as on the flats will help you to build both your endurance and your ability to recover, which will give you overall better fitness and a better experience during your ride. So I suppose the next, does anyone have any questions related to that?
I saw Mike had a question about if you could just give us kind of a quick overview even of what those levels are, like what is VO2 max? What is, sure. Basically, if you could almost explain how we can understand our own RPE, rate of perceived exertion, like what is exertion in this world and where are those levels?
Right. Should have made a little slide, but it's actually pretty simple. On one end, you have doing nothing, and on the other hand, you have going flat out, right? And doing nothing, you can sustain forever. Going flat out, you can sustain for only a very, very short time. And then you have the levels in between, and they are anchored to what's called lactate threshold. And lactate threshold is a physiological place where you begin to produce more blood lactate, which is the muscle or the muscle waste product of an endurance effort, than your body can get rid of, right? So that's that point where you're climbing a long climb, going as hard as you can, and your legs are beginning to falter, right? That's the lactate threshold. You can ride, you know, for about an hour or so, just under that, right at lactate threshold. But if you bump above, you have to back it down again. So lactate threshold is defined simply as maximum effort that you can do for 1 hour. That'll give you your lactate threshold. So you can measure on your heart monitor what your heart rate is during lactate threshold. And obviously if you have a power meter, you can see what your average power is for 1 hour. Or quick way to do it, because 1 hour is a long time to do a hard effort, is to just do 20 minutes and subtract 4% from that. And that'll give you your lactate threshold. So lactate threshold is level 4. So from nothing, you have active recovery is level 1. Then the next level after active recovery is endurance. And after that is tempo. And then level 4 is lactate threshold, right? And these are all ranges. Above that is VO2 max. And then above that is anaerobic capacity. And so anaerobic capacity is basically when you're going flat out. You can only sustain that for maybe 15 seconds at the most. Maybe a little more if you train it, which most of us really don't. But anyway, VO2 max is it's an effort that you can generally sustain for up to about 6 minutes, 4 to 6 minutes. Then lactate threshold is as hard as you can go for about an hour. And then tempo, most people can do a tempo ride if they truly stay in their tempo range and don't bump up above it too much. You can ride tempo for 3.5 hours, and you'll be pretty darn tired after that. That's a long time to do that level of effort. And then underneath that is endurance, which is something effectively and physiologically a level that everyone can ride almost indefinitely if you fuel properly and stop to pee, do things like that. Dave's an expert at level 2 riding.
Totally.
So, yeah, he can tell you more about that. And you'll probably agree that some of the intensity, if you do those higher levels of work, you're not only training your aerobic system, you're also training your muscles and your lactate processing system to be able to handle that and then clear that blood lactate out of your muscles and be able to do the next hill. So intensity gives you that ability to, so doing, say, threshold and VO2 work gives you that ability to bump up to those levels during an endurance or a tempo ride, and then come back down and maintain that endurance or tempo pace for the rest of the ride without struggling. Does that make sense?
It does.
This is a lot of information to just sort of kind of throw at people for training. So I'm happy if you guys want to follow up with emails or something like that. I'm happy to give you some resources and chat with you a little bit.
Sorry, somebody had a question.
No, after the meeting. So, but yeah, go ahead.
If you could translate, okay, these, so with the levels that you very clearly articulated, I mean, that's really good to know too, is really, you know, what is lactic threshold? You know, what's happening when, you know, I'll be hitting a hill and my legs will start burning.
Right.
And pull it back, you know, and then when I'm training for something, then I'll know that just, I won't be using a power meter, but I'll be using a heart rate meter. And I'll use my heart rate and be able to gauge where I'm at to train at these certain zones. If you could kind of take that zone explanation and translate it to what a training plan might look like, say an 8-week training plan toward a century, you know, what that kind of even looks like, so we can see how to translate that into action.
Yeah. So 8 weeks so the generally accepted kind of minimal lead time to a target event is 12 weeks. Usually coaches talk in terms of 12 weeks from like 0 to successfully completing your event. Now, of course, that varies by the person. It depends also on how much or how little that person rides. So if they're starting from almost 0 and they have a little experience, you know, 12 weeks is plenty of time. If there are folks like you who ride regularly and have experience cycling and doing these events, 8 weeks is usually plenty of time to get ready. So the way things are usually divided for a century over 12 weeks is the first 4 weeks are what are called a base phase. And so you are building that endurance foundation, right? And then the second 4 weeks are like a tempo and sub-threshold phase. So basically sub-threshold is exactly what it sounds like. It's just underneath that threshold level or right into it. It's technically it's defined as 87 to 93% of your lactate threshold number, right? Of your lactate threshold power, your lactate threshold heart rate. And then that last 4 weeks before the event is where you start to put a little peak on your form, right? And that's where you do your threshold and VO2 max stuff. Now, if you ride a lot, you can basically skip that base phase, right? And just do that 8 weeks phase where you're doing your tempo work for about 4 weeks, give or take a little, and then your threshold work, sub-threshold work. So what it would look like in terms of a day-to-day plan kind of depends on the rider and the schedule, which is why I made Velofro, right? And which is why people hire coaches. But on a very basic level, you want to do no more than about 2 days of intensity. Well, let me start from the beginning. Every build phase should be followed by a rest phase. Typically, build and rest is built into 4-week segments. So you do 3 weeks of progressive build, and then you do a rest week, which means, you know, you drop your overall weekly training load by about 10 to 20% from that last build week. And then you start again and you build up again and rest. So you have what's called a 4-week periodization. But as we get older, it's harder and harder to do like 3 build weeks in a row, because if you're like me, you get tired after 2 weeks and you're like, man, I just want to take a break. And so you do what's called a 3-week periodization. You build for 2 weeks, then you back down like 10, 15% for the 3rd week, then you build another 2 weeks, back down 10, 15%. So that's how you can, if you think about it, the big picture in terms of periodization, you want to build for a couple of weeks progressively, and then drop that training load a little bit on the third week. Or, you know, if you're particularly good at endurance and you have a lot of experience and you have a lot of energy like Dave, maybe you can do a 4-week periodization even if you're 100 years old, which Dave, you probably will do when you're 100 years old. But anyway, there's always some exceptions to the rule. And the famous answer when people ask coaches questions, the answer is usually, well, it depends. And that's so true because it kind of does depend on a lot of different factors, which again, why I made VeloPro and why people hire coaches. So now we have the phases, right, of building and recovery. Now, what you do during those build and recovery segments is also important. So if you have 8 weeks, you're going to do some tempo work, then followed by more tempo work and sub-threshold and threshold work. You want to make the weeks progressively harder in terms of training load, which on those phases means not so much endurance, but intensity. And so you want to build in that first 4-week section, probably 2 days of intensity a week. So take, for example, people usually do long weekends, right? Because they work during the week. So they ride their endurance stuff on Saturday and Sunday, take Monday off, do an easy ride Tuesday just to shake out the legs. And we'll talk about easy rides later because most people do their easy rides too hard and their hard rides not hard enough. So you want to do a truly easy ride. It should feel like something, it should be so easy that you can do it like wearing your street clothes and not break a sweat. It's literally a stroll on your bike, like around the neighborhood for like 30 minutes, 45 minutes. It should feel like a complete and total waste of training time. And if that's what it feels like, then you did it right. If it feels like training, you went too hard. And then Tuesday, do some intensity. Wednesday, some endurance. Thursday, some intensity. Maybe take Friday off or do a little bit of an easy ride. And then endurance Saturday and Sunday. That's just a kind of general way to incorporate work weekends and intensity as well as endurance. Can vary from person to person. Some people, they don't work or they're retired or they work for themselves. And so they can do long days on Mondays and Tuesdays. So obviously the schedule shifts. What you don't want to do is do your high intensity work when you're tired from something else. So you don't want to do 2 long days, 3 hours, 4 hours, a weekend day, and then Monday do your lactate threshold intervals because you'll underperform in your intervals. And also because you'll underperform, you won't get as much out of them, right? So you want to do them when you don't have to be totally fresh, but you want to do them when you're decently rested in relation to the rest of the things you're doing. And so you do progressive weeks like that. And then on your rest week, you just back down the intensity to 1 day during the week. You can take out of the 7 days of the week, 3 to 4, depending on how you're feeling, days completely off. Then on the other days are generally easy. And then one is high intensity, like VO2, and the other is a decent endurance day, like maybe 2.5, 3 hours. If you feel good about endurance, 3.5 hours. You want to drop that volume and that intensity significantly in that rest week. And then you start the cycle again. As you get closer to your peak, maybe 3 weeks out from the event, if you do a week with 3 days of hard, high intensity and maybe 1 less endurance day, that works too. Because then you're kind of putting that peak on that fitness house, right? You're called what we call like a breakthrough ride, right? Puts the steel in your legs, gets you right to that peak of fitness, you rest and then taper down to your event a little bit, and then you're good to go.
What does a taper look like?
Right. So for lazy people, they just stop riding until their event. And that's not generally what I recommend. If you're going to do a taper, you want to do it in sort of a controlled manner. And so all the taper is a backing down from your normal training levels progressively to your event day. So basically, you always hear riders talk about good form, and not in terms of technique, but like in terms of fitness and form. They bandy that term around, but they generally don't know what it means. But looked at simply, form is a combination of fitness on one hand and freshness on the other, right? So if you're training a lot, you're going to be fit, but you're not going to be fresh. And if you don't train at all, you're not going to be fit, but you'll be pretty fresh. And so balancing that, sort of in the last week before your event is really important. So you arrive to your event with just the right combination of fitness, not having detrained during the last week and a half, and freshness, not coming into it too tired from having trained a little too much. And so that taper is really important. And in general terms, in that taper week, that last week leading up to your event, say it's on a Saturday, you'll do your last big endurance day the Sunday before, take Monday off, Tuesday easy, say, do a little bit of intensity on Wednesday, then take Thursday off, and then just do a really easy ride on Friday, like an hour, stroll around the neighborhood in your street clothes, right? Stroll on your bike, and then Saturday is your event. And so that way, you're basically sort of winding it down. You're putting in a little bit of intensity to kind of stimulate that, to sort of maintain that muscle response, neurological response to that type of work. So your body doesn't forget, and you have stiff legs on Saturday, do a little intensity, but then just back it down a little bit. And then there are a lot of other things you want to do, like make sure you eat properly, make sure you stay hydrated, all in that last, well, generally, but all in that last week, right prior to your event.
There's a question about intensity, and just to make sure I'm understanding it. So when you say like even layers of intensity, it's a lot of times I even translate that to my heart rate, just because I usually have a heart rate monitor strapped on me, and I don't have a power meter. So I'll say I know where my max heart rate is. I know where kind of my levels are, and I'll think, okay, my heart's going a little faster, my legs will burn a little harder. That is an increase in intensity. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely accurate. So, coaches prefer for riders these days to have power meters. But, and we can get into the reasons for those. There are very good reasons for that. But when it comes down to it, in order to, improve and sort of measure your improvement, you don't have to have a power meter, right? We trained athletes long before power meters existed, and they got better, and we helped them. And so, but having a power meter helps your coach to a huge extent and can help the rider. But measuring your heart rate is your body's response to the effort that, say, a power meter would measure. The power meter measures your effort. Your heart rate measures your response to that effort. So in some ways, measuring the response to that effort is almost more important, right? Because that's what matters in the end, is how your body reacts to the training input. And so dividing up or training by your heart rate zones can be really useful, because that way you're not sort of beholden to putting out a certain power number at a certain time. If your heart rate matches what that level would be anyway, maybe that's telling you, okay, my legs are tired, but my aerobic system's good, so we can do it, level 3 at an aerobic level, even if the legs are still at level 2, and you'll still get that training benefit. So taking that one step further, if you don't have a heart rate monitor, you can ride by what we call RPE, rate of perceived exertion. And that you can measure that. You can't really measure that because it's just sort of a scale based on your perceived effort, right? So it's a little different for everyone. But usually I encourage people to use like a 1 through 5 or a 1 through 10 scale, where 10 is, as hard as you can go, can only be sustained for a few minutes, or not even that, for a few seconds. And 1 is just really easy, stroll around the neighborhood. And so if you train by RPE, you'll want to make sure that it's hard to do stuff at the very high end, and it's not necessarily particularly useful for endurance events or century events, but you definitely want to spend your intensity days spending a fair amount of time kind of in the lower second half of that scale, right? So if it's a 5 scale, you want to spend time at 3.5, 4. If it's a 10 scale, 5.5, 6, 6.5, 7, right up there. Really, really pushing yourself. It should be a little bit uncomfortable, not something you want to do all day at all. But there's simple ways to kind of integrate that. Obviously, spirited group rides are one way to do it. But if you're not into that, you can do time trial like the Coburg one, or just every time you go up some of those hills, like, was it Wolf Creek Road down your way? Has a few hills that are like just a few minutes long, right? Kind of rolls up, not particularly steep, not particularly intense. Just hammer those hills. Just go as hard as you can up those hills for 5, 6 minutes at a time, then just back off and recover. And then on the next hill, just hammer up the hill and then recover. So doing intervals, that's essentially what you're doing is intervals, right? Everybody knows what those are. It's intensity followed by recovery. And when you do it in a structured way, you can, I wouldn't say you necessarily benefit more, but at least you can sort of measure what you did and compare it to other workouts. Did I get a little bit off track there?
No, I think you're covered. It's all really great info. Now, on those quote easier days, I see a question somebody had about cross training, and I know you're a big fan of yoga, but could you talk a little about how people cross train and even what that is as advantageous to cycling performance?
Yeah. So on a really simple physiological level, the best training for cycling is cycling, right? You won't necessarily be any faster if you run around or you do yoga or you do hill running or something like that. That won't necessarily make you any faster on your bike. What it will do, though, is several things. It will make you a better balanced athlete, right? Because cycling is very 1 or 2 dimensional, and the bike restricts what you can do with your body. And so cyclists just inherently, because of the nature of the sport, develop strengths and weaknesses that are imbalanced in the body, right? So you develop very strong glutes if you're positioned right and your glutes are firing, strong hamstrings, strong quads, but then your hip flexors are very weak and sometimes too tight, sometimes too loose, depending on the person. And so that's not, as many of us find as we get older, particularly sustainable from an athletic point of view. So what cross training does is it helps your body stay in balance. So not so that you can necessarily be faster, but that you can ride at a high level for a longer period of time, right? So there's several types of, and also it helps prevent you getting injured. If that wasn't obvious, that's kind of the follow through from that, right? If it's more sustainable, you're less prone to injury. So cross training can mean several things. It could be aerobic, like running. It can be weight bearing, like hill running, or just running, or lifting weights, or doing yoga, things like that. And one kind of cross training that's beneficial in some ways is swimming, because that helps you really strengthen your core, which is really important to maintaining your position on the bike for a long period of time. But what it doesn't do is strengthen your bones. So I recommend people do a combination of things like yoga, maybe some running, maybe a bit of swimming if they like to. It really depends on what you like to do. If you hate running, then don't run. Do yoga, lift some weights, take long walks. That's what I did in Girona this winter. Is I took basically a month off, and that kind of deep rest is another subject we should cover here. But I took a month off, and then it wasn't really on purpose, but I kind of knew that it would help. Is I did lots of long walks in the hills. Dave, you probably know the hills, the Les Gavares forest to the east of town.
Been there.
Right, and you probably walked up to St. Michael Castle too. It's a great walk, and it's kind of hard, and it's kind of hard coming down, but it's not too hard. Everybody can do it, but it doesn't necessarily make you work aerobically, but it really makes you work your leg muscles as you're going up, and it works your quads as you're coming down, and it strengthens your bones, gives you something different to do, has beautiful views, gets you in the fresh air, but it's not your bike. And so you can do something different. That way, when you get back to cycling, you'll be very excited about cycling, as I was, even though I felt sort of out of shape. That's normal. You get back and do it pretty quickly, especially if you've been doing that cross training. I would recommend some aerobic component. So one of the things that's important as we age is not to go too hard, too much without proper rest. In the old days, professionals and high-level cyclists would quite literally hang their bikes up for a couple months at a time, sort of do nothing, and just enjoy the holidays, spend time with their families, maybe run a little bit, but then, they would start to get back on their bikes and ride. These days, when professionals take 2 weeks off in the season, they portray that as that being a long time. And that's not really true. That's actually a very short time, and that's not sustainable. And so what we're seeing now is a lot more professionals that in their 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th season start to have heart arrhythmias and cardiac issues. Already 2 or 3 top riders this year alone had heart ablation surgeries, and they're quite famous, right? And Yanni is one of them, and I forget the other guy's name. And so what this comes from is a whole lot of intensity without enough rest. That's the simple answer, right? It's not eating too many steaks or ice creams. It's because they just are revving high all the time. And then in the off season, instead of taking a month or 2 months, letting everything just sort of go a little bit, and then building back up and rebuilding that foundation, they're trying to kind of stay in it, keep their foundation and keep their intensity. And the cost of that, they can do it because they're world-class athletes. They can do it for several years in a row, but nobody can do it forever. And eventually it catches up with them. So we see that in professionals, but then also in older athletes who have been cycling for a long time, Dave, and who do a lot of high intensity work, or really kind of, it tends to happen more in type A people who maybe is not Dave. Maybe it is Dave actually. But type A people who are racers, right? Who are revving up at, super threshold VO2 AC a lot. I know you don't do that. You're just doing a lot of endurance. So it's probably not such a big issue for you. But if you're always revving high without any deep rest, not only is that not good for your training, but it's potentially bad for your overall health, really. So you want to make sure you get that deep rest in addition to sort of that strength-based cross training. The other thing to mention with cross training, so cross training is good. In some ways, it's, especially in older athletes, it's good all the time, right? Like taking long walks, doing a little bit of running, mixing it up, doing things other than just cycling all the time. because, you know, it keeps your mind fresh, keeps your body fit. Doing core work is something I encourage people to do at a minimum. So if my athletes run during the off season a little bit, or swim, or do long hikes, then I'll also have them do their core routines a couple times a week. And then during the season, I'll still have them do their core routines. It'll be maybe a 3/4 version of their routine and 1 or 2 days a week instead of 2 or 3 days a week. But they'll still do it. Instead of a core strengthening routine, it'll be more of like a core strength maintenance routine, right? You're just sort of maintaining that core strength. And that, more often than not, that helps them get through the season injury-free. And if they do get injured from a crash or something, having that core strength helps them recover, decreases the chances of them having imbalances when they get back on the bike because of the injuries, and just contributes to their overall physical and mental well-being. So yeah, what did I miss?
You covering it really well. And I see a question too about max heart rate. Okay.
Right.
And how long should you sustain your max heart rate? But that is also a question that kind of on your point about that month off. And, you know, I know when I take that month off, and my month kind of hits me, like it always happens kind of naturally, like it starts raining and it's late in the year. And just kind of almost with a circadian rhythm, my body's saying, hey, take some time off. And it's about a month.
Right.
But to Richard's question about max heart rate, what I do notice is that a lot of times my max heart rate fluctuates. And I will have, especially when I'm peaking, I'll be sometimes a little lower max heart rate than what I notice after, say, my rest month. Could you kind of talk about all that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So heart rate depends on several factors, and comparing one person's heart rate to another person's heart rate is completely worthless, because max heart rate, resting heart rate, and threshold heart rates are different for everybody. So some top athletes have resting heart rates in the 30s beats per minute, some in the 70s. And it's the same in the general population, same for everybody. Some people can rev their heart rates really high. My brother used to hit 210 beats per minute when he was racing. Yeah, he's I guess he's kind of like a whippet. He's very excitable, and but he was good. He was a category 1, so it sort of worked. But then other people, their max heart rate's in the 150s, even, you know, when they're 25 years old. So that's all to say that heart rate's relative to the individual. So getting to know what your heart rate is and what your max is and what your resting is, that you can take and just apply it to yourself, but it doesn't mean anything to anyone else. So when you're riding with your friends and one is 150 and the other is 160, it's not necessarily the case that the 161 is working any harder. It's just their heart rate's higher, but it doesn't mean anything, because everybody's heart's different. Everybody's stroke volume is different. And so, and everybody's blood volume is different. Their respiratory capacity is different, and their VO2 max is different. Their ability to process oxygen into their blood. That's what VO2 max is. That's different for everybody. So all those things are very individual, but getting to know what your heart rate is and what that means to you is important. Now, having said that, maximum heart rate varies, like you mentioned, Dave, depending on your accumulated aerobic stress level, right? So if you take a month off, sit around, eat Twinkies and Coke all winter, look out at the rain, and then you go out on your bike and you hammer as hard as you can up the first hill, your heart rate will shoot to way higher than you could ever get it when you were training a lot the season before, right? Because that's that fresh heart, you know, your body's really fresh, you're cardiovascularly and aerobically rested, and so your body is essentially letting your heart go to its absolute maximum. In the season, even after rest weeks, if you do a rest week and you see your absolute maximum heart rate the next week, then your rest week was too easy, right? During the season, your maximum heart rate will always be a little bit suppressed from what your absolute max is, because your body's protecting your heart, it's protecting your aerobic system, your accumulated fatigue is there, and it's not essentially allowing your body to go to its absolute max. So that's not really a bad thing, because you don't need to go to your absolute max to get fitter. And in fact, as we discussed earlier, your absolute max is only sustainable for a few seconds, right? Your max heart rate is 150 and you're going flat out up a hill. You can only do that for you probably see that heart rate for about 20 or 30 seconds, but your legs will start to have begun to start failing before that, and you'll be forced to sort of back it down to something that's more sustainable. So whereas you can base efforts off of max heart rates for max effort, the more effective way to do it is to take your lactate threshold heart rate and base your efforts off of that, right? Because that is your heart rate average over, 30, 40, 60-minute sort of sustained heart effort, right? Your maximum effort, you see your heart rate over that, and you say, okay, well, it's at 160, say, beats per minute, that I start to bump up against my lactate threshold, right? I can't really go higher than 160 beats per minute, because then my legs start to falter and I have to back off. So that's your lactate threshold, and you can base your zones off of that, and then you can stay in your zones when you train. So that's pretty good coverage of heart rate. This is a lot of stuff. There's a lot of really big training stuff getting sort of thrown at you guys at once.
To that point, I know you have software that helps me get there. And I have experience with not only VeloPro, but I have experience with kind of the cast of characters, Trainer Roads, with everything has their own thing right now. And I really liked VeloPro because it worked with me, a middle-aged athlete in my lifestyle, and a busy lifestyle, and got me ready for basically large rando events, basically.
Right.
Gravel rando stuff. But if you could talk about, so I'm 6 weeks out now from a century that we're putting on, how's that like? And I don't have a power meter, but could you talk about if you need a power meter or if just a heart rate? And you could also tell us about how the AI about VeloPro, your software, is really great. And it's really cool. And if you could kind of talk about how your program works.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
So as I said earlier, your power, the power you produce on your bike, is the measure of exactly what you're doing, right? And the work you're doing. Your heart rate is your body's response to that. So if you measure your work that you're doing and your work capacity, you have a way to measure how much you've improved. So for example, you can start, sorry, one of my eyelashes is poking me in the eye. You can start by doing a time trial, or even just hammering up a long 15, 20, 25-minute hill. And you can see what your average power is for that. Then you can do your training, and then a few weeks later, you can do the same thing with the same previous conditions, right? Maybe coming off a rest day and an easy day, and then hammer up the hill. And you can see your average power, and you can see if it's improved, which if you've been training, hopefully it has. With your heart rate, you'll still be at your lactate threshold heart rate, whether your power has improved or not, right? Because your body's response is the same to that level of effort, but because you've improved in your training, your work capacity is higher. Essentially, you think of it, your heart is stronger, but also your legs are stronger. And so you can put out more power over that amount of time. Now, if you don't have a power meter, you can still measure whether or not you've improved, because you just take that same hill and you take a fixed point in the beginning and a fixed point at the end, and you just measure your time that you took to get up the hill. So if you're training for something that's like short and intense, like a short time trial or cyclocross or something like that, doing it up a 5 or 6 minute hill, that's good. But really what you want to do is you want to do it over like a 20-minute hill or a little bit longer climb, something that really taxes your aerobic system, something you have to pace yourself on, and something, the longer you do it, the more you are able to minimize the variables that can affect the outcome of the test. So do it in the woods where there's less wind, do it on the same climb, come into it with the same conditions. And if you go faster between the 2 points, then you know that you're producing more power. And again, at a maximal effort sustained over a given amount of time, your heart rate will be the same. You will just be stronger. So because we can measure your the work you do with a power meter, or to some extent, although it's not terribly happy with it because it's kind of back calculating it, we can take your GPS data and your speed data and the weight of you and your bike, and we can kind of calculate the power that it required for you to do the ride you did, or the section of the ride you did. Again, there's no substitute for actually measuring, and kind of calculating is not really my favorite, but we had to do that because, we need to give people someplace to start. And so if you are able to measure the work you do over a given amount of time, then you can measure the riders, then you can get a picture of the rider's work capacity. So what VeloPro does is it takes your rides that you do, it prescribes you rides, and it doesn't prescribe you rides on days that you can't ride, or rides that are above your level. And you do them or you don't do them, depending on your schedule or whatever happens. Nobody has a perfect schedule. The system will rejig your workouts depending on whether or not you completed them or not. And then every once in a while, when you do a test, the system will see that, and then it will either change your workout structure or change your levels, because obviously if you're more powerful, your levels change and you go harder. And so you improve. Now, what happens over time when you do this, and this is the AI part of it, because everybody's like, oh, you're building robots that are going to kill us. And that's, some people probably are, but I'm definitely not. The AI part of it simply takes your training data and compares it to your previous training data and learns what your capacities are as a rider. So if you're always having trouble completing your VO2 workouts, VeloPro will see that and it'll say, right, those aren't effective for that person right now. And so we'll back that off and we'll substitute a little bit more until they get to that level where they can do those VO2 workouts. Then we'll work them back in. And so it gets better over time at prescribing your workouts and training you to get to your peak. So the idea is that if you use VeloPro for a month, it's not, it's just like any other training plan. It's more flexible, obviously, but it will not have had enough time or data to really learn how to more effectively train you. But if you use it for a year and a half, then it gets better and better at prescribing exactly what you need. Kind of like a coach, but more like a robo coach.
So it kicks out workouts. So
right.
I know I can either put the workout, I could literally download it onto my Zwift program and it takes me through a virtual world where I'm seeing the VeloPro workout, but it'll also, or I could kick it out and it goes, okay, you're going to ride like this for X number of minutes and then like that for X number of minutes. And
right. So, oh, go ahead.
No, that's my question.
Yeah. So I probably should just give a quick overview of what what happens with VeloPro when you start. So once you sign up and log in, it asks you some very specific questions. Like your age, your gender. Those things are, I know it's politically correct, politically sort of questionable these days, but physiologically, it's kind of important for the system to know that. And then, more importantly, it asks you on which days you can and can't ride every week. So if you have like a standing Sunday, like all day with your kids, and you can't ride, you just tick Sunday, can't ride. If you can't ride on Monday because it's a busy work day, you tick Monday. Basically, though, it won't let you tick more than 3 or 4 days, because you have to ride at least 3 or 4 days a week to probably gain anything. So you pick the days you can and can't ride. Then you pick the hours per week you have for riding. So if you're like Dave and you have like all day, every day, you can stick, 25, 30 hours a week. And the system won't necessarily give you that, because again, over time, it'll be like, well, he thinks he can ride 30 hours a week, but we know that actually he can't. And so it'll give you what you really can do. After a while, it'll start you off with those hours, but after a while, it'll learn that you can't do it. Or if you can and you can do more, it'll say, well, this guy actually can ride more, but he's limited to 30 because of his schedule. So then it won't prescribe more than that, and it'll up the intensity. So basically, you choose the hours per week you can ride. Most people have between 6 and 12 hours a week to ride their bikes, but you put in the number, and then it asks you to estimate your threshold power, and it gives you a little explanation and calculation for how to do that, what your heart rate levels are if you know them, and then it asks you your experience level, right? So if you just started cycling, it's different than if you've been riding for a long time, simply because if you're an experienced cyclist, your improvement curve is not going to be quite as steep because you've already gotten, to a higher level than if you're just a new cyclist and you still have to discover what you can accomplish. Generally, the curve's a little steeper. So then you put in your experience level, and then the last thing you need to do, because no training plan is useful without having a goal to which to train, or at least a target date for which to reach your peak fitness, you have to set a goal sometime in the future. And that goal has to be at least 4 to 6 weeks in the future. So once you set the goal, you set the goal date, the goal type, and the number of days or hours that the goal encompasses, right? So if you're training for a 1-day century ride, it might be 1 day, 5 or 6 hours. If you're training for a stage race that's like 6 days long, or a long tour that you're doing, it's more than that. And then, given all of that input, the system will push out a calendar with your training schedule on it. And so, again, it won't give you rides on days that you say you can't ride anyway. And then, but you don't have to worry about that too much, because schedules change. And if you end up riding on your rest day, the system will see that when you upload it, and it'll change the rest of it going forward and adapt to that schedule change. So that's basically how VeloPro works. And then over time, it gets better and better at seeing what you do and what you're able to do, and switching up your schedule to get you there.
Cool. It worked really well for me, and I highly recommend it. So we covered a lot. Thank you so much. And I want to, before we cut out, we're right up at 7 p.m. If there's any other questions in the room, I think we covered them all. I've had a list going in front of me that I've been peppering you with.
Oh yeah, there's the chat, but I didn't have that up.
We covered them all.
Well, John had a question. He says he's planning to do 6 centuries, each one about a month apart. He wants to know how he should train in between.
Right. So, yeah, that's a good question, because, but the answer is a lot simpler than if you were doing 6, high-level races that you wanted to win, all of them a month apart. that would be very hard to get to those fitness peaks 6 times in one season. But because they're century rides and they're non-competitive, and your goal is maybe just to finish them, or maybe to improve your time from the one before or from the last time you did it. The thing to do in between, once you've built that foundation, you want to basically balance maintaining that aerobic foundation with building a little bit more intensity in there. Maintaining the aerobic foundation is going to be easy, especially once you've done a couple of those long rides. Then you have a good foundation and you don't actually have to ride a ton to maintain it. But what you should do in the time you ride is do a bit more intensity. So that'll put that second floor and that peak on your fitness. So you'll be able to recover better in between the climbs, and you'll be able to go a little bit faster. And even if you don't go faster, better fitness will just mean you can ride it at the same speed more comfortably and enjoy it a little more. So that's the short answer, really. It's, that's another, well, it depends question in some ways, but it's, the short answer is maintain your aerobic base. You don't have to do, huge long rides, but up your intensity a little bit and make sure you rest well in between.
And then I have one more question, and hopefully it's fairly easy. I understand why you need to warm up before a ride, but I've never understood why people cool down after a ride and what a cool down is.
Right. So cool down is, in a lot of ways, it's what you might imagine. It's sort of the opposite of the warm up, right? When you warm up, you actually don't want to just kind of spin around easily for 15 or 20 minutes. You want to do some harder efforts, open up those muscles, get those first few efforts out of the way. Have you guys ever noticed that if you just go out the door and you hammer up a hill, it's like your body's like, whoa, wait, let's warm up and get into this. But then once you've recovered from that a little bit, when you hammer up the next hill, you can do it and you can sustain that effort, right? That's because after that first climb, that intensity helped to warm you up. So when you warm up, you want to make sure that you spin a little bit, and then you want to do some shorter, harder efforts. They don't have to be, flat out, but they should tax you, and they should feel like you're burning fuel, and you might be burning a little too much fuel for the effort that's coming up, because that's what helps you dig deep enough and perfuse your muscles and your capillaries with oxygen and open them up for the efforts that are coming. Now, it'll feel like you're burning fuel, but really what you're doing is you are helping to make your muscles more efficient more quickly, so they'll just do better overall for the rest of the day. Now, on the other end of that, your cool down doesn't involve any real intensity at all. And what that should be is just like a slow ramp down to when you stop. So if you finish a race, or if you finish a hard effort, or your neighborhood's kind of up on a hill, it's hard to finish your ride uphill all day. You don't want to just finish with a hard climb to your garage and then kind of climb off. It's better to either put your bike on the trainer right away and just spin easily for like 10 or 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be that long. Or just kind of ride around for 10 or 15 minutes. The simple way to cool down, if you don't live in a geographically challenging neighborhood, is just to make sure your last 15 minutes of your ride are really simple. I live in Portland. I live in the middle of the city, so you can't really go that fast. And so I have not always an optimal warm up heading out, but I always have an optimal cool down, because it's just really easy spin, all the way home. Have to stop at the stop signs, traffic lights, whatever. But you're basically just, instead of just racing into your garage, jumping off your bike and going into the shower, you're just ramping down that effort and cooling down. And basically all it does is all that accumulated lactate in your muscles just slowly gets processed out. It gives your body a little head start on processing that out. And so what a cool down does essentially is it just helps you recover, so that you can rest a little better that day and then have a better workout or event the next day, because you're recovered a little better. And then, pro tip, after you finish every ride, have a little sweet treat, right? You have a shoe show and you earned it. eat that. You have like a little pastry at the coffee shop with some sweet, have that, because you will have been burning the muscle glycogen that's stored up in your muscles after a night of rest and normal eating. And so you want to replenish that. And part of optimal recovery is right after your workout, giving your body a little kind of simple carbohydrate treat to get that, to kickstart that recovery and that refilling of your muscles with glycogen.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome place to end, Adnan. It ended with end of the ride and eating a jusho crema. So
you know what I did all winter.
Yeah, and then I put my legs up and fall asleep. So thanks again, really appreciate it. And we'll be sharing. This is recorded. It's going to be on our website. And
cool.
I published your URL to VeloPro.
Awesome.
To all my Gears friends. It's super affordable and it's really great. And even for a couple of months, it really will train you even how to train. It's a friendly program.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's free to use for a month, and actually OBRA members get it free for a year. But just check it out. You know, I can continue the subscription for you if you guys want. But more importantly, if you want to share my email address, that's fine. Share my Fearless Endurance address, though.
Got it.
And if you guys have any follow-up questions related to this, you know, I'm not going to sort of become your coach for like the next month, but I'm happy to answer any follow-ups to this, no problem.
Thanks, buddy.
You bet. Thank you, guys.
Have a good night. Thanks, friends who showed up for Gears. This is our monthly educational program. Not sure what's on the docket for next month. We'll come up with something. But check out velopro.bike and have a great night.